Hello, welcome everyone. My name is İpek Kocamaryosmoğlu. I am the director of the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies program here at the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. And I don't know, I see that people are joining us from all over, and it's wonderful to see that. So for some of you, it's good afternoon, good evening. And here in Evanston, it's snowing. It has been snowing for the last 2 days. It's early even for our standards, but at this point in 2020, I think if we see pigs flying around, we'll be like, meh, you know. It's just, it is to be expected, but it is kind of depressing on top of everything else to see this and think about all those kids who'll be trying to trick or treat this weekend. But anyhow, seriously, I hope that you are staying warm and you are staying safe and healthy, because we're now bracing for what looks like, going to be may become an even worse stage of the pandemic in the coming months. So in addition to that, there are lots of other things going on. And it's so hard to shift our gaze from, especially the upcoming elections here in the US. And therefore, I really, really appreciate your taking the time to join us today. But I can assure you that your commitment, your time will be amply rewarded. We have a terrific panel coming up. And the topic today is the ongoing conflict, worrisome ongoing conflict in Nagorno Karabakh, or Artsakh, as it's also known. And since you're already here, I'm assuming that unlike most of the US public, you have at least a basic level of familiarity with this region, the Caucasus, and this ongoing conflict. And so I'm thinking that you may have also noticed that despite its significance in, not only in geopolitical terms, but also humanitarian terms, its significance, we haven't really seen a lot of attention. It hasn't really garnered a lot of attention from the mainstream US media so far. I mean, there are some good analyses here and there, but not really what you would expect. And I think this is not just a matter of the elections and the pandemic. They're taking over the news cycle, obviously. But obviously, I think it has to do with the absence of meaningful engagement from the US, just like anywhere else, even though the US was one of the co-chairs of the Minsk group that was, formed to seek a resolution precisely for this reason. It seems to be missing in action. It's just their perfunctory, show of presence. But I have to also say that it is, I find it striking. Maybe, you think this is to be expected, but in Turkey, when I look at Turkish media, to the extent that you can, talk about some sort of independent media in Turkey, but I'm thinking of other posts that are reporting from outside the country, there is not really a sustained interest. Again, it's sporadic. And I find it's really striking because Turkey, it seems, has, deliberately inserted itself to this conflict. And this is happening not through a diplomatic show of support for the Azeris, but sending of weapons, material, and all sorts of surveillance means. And perhaps most worrisome also in terms of mercenaries who were reportedly, recruited from Syria and then, shipped off to Karabakh. So to say the least, we have a very volatile situation here. And if you consider the arc of Turkish foreign policy in the past decade, where it was and where it has ended up, the situation, I mean, I think the direness of the situation becomes more obvious. And we know that also the support for Erdogan inside Turkey is at a historical low. The Turkish lira has been losing value, it's sliding off. There is a looming balance of payments crisis, probably. And, it's not clear how much Erdogan is willing or able to risk at this point. And when you layer this with the history of the region, it becomes, those, warning bells start ringing. And when I say history, of course, I'm not meaning that there are ancient hatreds here or like these intractable differences, because there is nothing ancient about imperialism and the nation state intersecting, or the authoritarian regime's use of ethnic difference to consolidate their own power and then weaponize ethnic differences, nationalism, to their own ends. So this is another example of that, and there's nothing ancient about this. So this is a very complicated issue for those reasons. There's humanitarian issues, there's diplomacy, there is history. But in order to make sense of that, today we have an exceptional group of experts. We have two highly esteemed scholars of the region, Laurence Brewers and Thomas de Waal. They have both written extensively on the region, on the role of Russia, and also relations between Armenia and Turkey in the shadow of the Armenian genocide. And Laurence Brewers is the program director for the Caucasus at the Conciliation Resources. This is a London-based conflict resolution peace-building institution. And Thomas de Waal is a fellow, senior fellow at the Carnegie Institute Europe. But we also have our own local expert, and she is the newest member of the Keyman team here at Buffett. She is Anoush Tamar Suni, and she's actually the real host of this panel. She'll be giving you another introduction in a second, but let me introduce the introducer. Anoush joined us from University of Michigan. She was a Manoogian Fellow in Armenian Studies and the Anthropology Department there. She is a UCLA trained anthropologist, and she's one of those rare junior scholars who she's able to combine, I would say, empirical, knowledge, rigor with theoretical sophistication and academic rigor with a very, human sense of sensitivity of looking at really sensitive, complicated issues. And she's currently working on a really interesting book project for which she did years of field research, ethnographic research in around the Van region in Turkey, actually very close to the Armenian border. And she's looking at the issue of memory and material remains, material culture, how they mediate our understanding of what happened in the past. And she's looking at the current, Kurdish community living there and the Armenian community who used to live there and obviously does not any longer. So we are extremely happy to have her here at Northwestern, and she'll be here for another year, during which I hope we'll have our normal, usual activities and not just, virtual platforms. So I'm going to now leave the floor to Anoush, and she'll take it from there. Welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Yosmaoglu, for that generous introduction. And thank you to all of those watching and to our two esteemed guests who have joined us today to share their expertise with the Buffett Institute and with the Northwestern community on this pressing contemporary political issue unfolding in the South Caucasus. Today, as Professor Yosmaoglu mentioned, we will be discussing the recent escalation of hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the contested region of Nagorno Karabakh, Artsakh, which is an ethnic Armenian enclave inside the territory of Azerbaijan. This conflict stretches back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and a war between the two nation states that left Karabakh de jure under the sovereignty of Azerbaijan and recognized thus by the international community, but de facto a self-governing territory. For the last 26 years, since the ceasefire of 1994 that ended the war but never quite brought peace, there was an uneasy status quo in the region until September 27th, when the conflict began anew. This last month has seen the worst fighting since the end of the war a quarter century ago, and this time, with the Republic of Turkey backing its ally, Azerbaijan, this long-standing regional dispute threatens to boil over into a wider international conflict. Over the past month, 3 ceasefires were brokered by Russia, France, and most recently the United States. And the most recent one just announced 2 days ago on October 25th, yet each attempt to quell the fighting quickly crumbled as each side accused the other of breaking the terms of the agreement. At present, the conflict continues, the number of casualties continue to rise, civilians continue to be displaced, and the road to a lasting peace remains unclear. It is the task of our panel today to try to attempt to unravel this complicated dispute and to provide some perspectives on the roots and possible directions of this protracted conflict. And for that, we are very fortunate, as Professor Yosmalu mentioned, to have today with us 2 experts on the region, Tom de Waal and Laurence Brewers. Tom de Waal is a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. He is an author of numerous publications about the region. The second edition of his book, The Caucasus, An Introduction, was published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. He's also the author of Great Catastrophe, Armenians and Turks in the Shadow of Genocide, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. And most relevant to our discussion today, he's the author of the authoritative book on the Nagorno Karabakh conflict, Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War, the second edition of which was published by NYU Press in 2013. He co-authored with Carlota Gall the book Chechnya, Calamity in the Caucasus, published by NYU Press in 1997, for which the authors were awarded the James Cameron Prize for Distinguished Reporting. Our second distinguished guest, Laurence Brewers, is the Caucasus Program Director at the London-based peacebuilding organization, Conciliation Resources. He has more than 20 years of experience as a researcher of conflicts in the South Caucasus and as a practitioner of peacebuilding initiatives in the region. He is the co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Caucasus Survey, the first dedicated scholarly journal for the Caucasus region, published since January 2015 by Taylor and Francis. He's also the author of Armenia and Azerbaijan, Anatomy of a Rivalry, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2019, and co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of the Caucasus, published in 2020, and Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World, published by IB Tauris in 2020. Our guests will present together today in tandem, and then I will moderate the question and answers. During the Q&A, I will ask that our audience type their questions and send them through the Zoom chat function, and I will collate the questions and then pose them to the speakers. Thus, while you are listening, please feel free to think about and formulate your questions. And now I will turn the floor over to our speakers, beginning with Laurence Brewers.
Thank you very much, Anoush. Thank you, Ipek. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you all this evening. What we're going to do is Tom and I are going to alternate in our presentation. I'm going to begin by discussing some root causes, midterm drivers, and short-term triggers. I'll then hand over to Tom, who will discuss the humanitarian crisis and international responses to the conflict, to the new conflict. And then we'll discuss a number of scenarios. So I'll discuss the military scenario, the scenario of regionalization, and then hand back over to Tom to discuss the possibilities for a revival in multilateral diplomacy. So I mean, over the last 30 years, we've seen this conflict framed in a number of different ways, as a post-Soviet ethno-territorial conflict, as one of Eurasia's frozen conflicts, as an enduring rivalry between two states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and most recently as one of a number of conflict theaters contested by regional powers in a multipolar world. In terms of root causes of the conflict, that's obviously a very long conversation. I'll try to summarize in terms of a number of clusters. The first would be geographic, imperial, and institutional legacies. Nagorno Karabakh is, of course, one of a number of borderlands that were violently contested during the post-First World War period between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That conflict was, in a sense, resolved after and as a function of the Sovietization of the region in the early 1920s. So an Armenian majority territory was incorporated into Soviet Azerbaijan and compensated, as it were, but with territorial autonomy. And Arsen Saparov, who I think is amongst the audience today, has written perhaps the definitive account of that process. The resulting configuration embedded a number of structural vulnerabilities into this context. The first of these was an enclave geography. Nagorno Karabakh was established as an ethnic Armenian majority island within Soviet Azerbaijan. A second vulnerability was the absence of any clear attribution of ownership. In the Soviet Union, almost all territories had an eponymous nationality associated with the territory. There were very few territories that were designating geographic rather than communal identities, and Nagorno Karabakh was one of them, as was Crimea, Nakhichevan, and indeed Azerbaijan, until the official redefinition, renaming of Azerbaijani Turks as Azerbaijanis in 1937. That's the absence of a clear designation of primordial community emphasized the demographic factor, and what we saw over the course of the Soviet period was a lot of concern over Azerbaijani demographic growth in the territory. So the third vulnerability was the dysfunctionality of autonomy. Armenians in Nagorno Karabakh were not happy with the status and had no way to renegotiate it democratically. There were perennial protests whenever the Soviet Union went through its more liberal periods. And that brings me to the second kind of core cluster, which are the issues around security and a fundamental security dilemma that emerged after Mikhail Gorbachev declared his perestroika policy. And that led through a very complex series of events to a very one-sided military victory for the Armenian side in 1994. It was the only one of these conflicts that emerged at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union that had such a dramatic extent of overspill beyond the territory originally disputed. So there is a very difficult and significant legacy of mass human rights violations associated with that conflict, massacres and ethnic cleansing, large numbers of refugees on both sides, but also a substantial population of internally displaced ethnic Azerbaijanis from Nagorno Karabakh itself and from the districts around it that were occupied between 1992 and 1994. The third cluster is the embedding of the conflict in two national identities, whether as victim or as victor, and the inability of elites to dilute this in any way. Elites across the divide have adopted the conflict narrative as a sine qua non of political legitimacy and the consensus issue in each society, often obscuring myriad other issues on which there has been no consensus. So while I would argue that there are rally round the flag effects, there should be no underestimation of the resonance of this issue across the divide. In my own work, I've emphasized the role of geopolitical visions, of geopolitical cultures that have nurtured expansive definitions of homeland, augmented Armenia, wide Azerbaijanism, that overlap considerably and actively seek to exclude the other from these very expansively imagined notions of homeland. So a few words on the peace process that was established in the mid-1990s. This conflict was given to a new regional security organization, the Conference and then Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. There were high hopes for the OSCE at the time of its formation. But over time, we saw that there have been successive types of obstacles to OSCE mediation. In the early period, there was a problem of fractured mediations. Russia, Euro-Atlantic powers, Iran were competing with non-coordinated rival interventions, and to a degree, one could argue that we're seeing elements of that replaying today. Later, we saw a number of issues around sequencing. For many years, there was extensive debate over a package versus a phased approach to the resolution to the conflict. And the basic principles emerged as an attempt to reconcile this dilemma. That's the proposal that's been on the table since 2007. And then perhaps over the last 15 years or so, across the divide, at least until 2018 in Armenia, we saw what I would term authoritarian conflict strategies hollowing out OSCE mediation from within by deploying illiberal strategies that undermine the underlying logic of the liberal peace on which OSCE mediation was based. So between the mid-1990s and around 2006, one or other of the Minsk Group co-chairs, France, Russia, or the United States, would lead specific initiatives. But after that time, we began to see a kind of default to informal Russian leadership of this process. And that was visible in the absence of specifically French or US political attention and underwriting of mediation initiatives, to the fact that Russian co-chairs actually serve considerably longer terms than their French or US counterparts, and the establishment of a separate trilateral framework of Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan in parallel to the Minsk Group. The last big significant push on the mediation front was led by President Dmitry Medvedev, ending in the city of Kazan with an unsuccessful summit in 2011. So moving to some of the midterm drivers, the post-war status quo increasingly came into tension with disparity in the development between smaller, resource-poor Armenia and larger and hydrocarbon-rich Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan twice in 2006 and 2011 doubled its defense budget, acquiring new state-of-the-art hardware with a technical edge over Armenian kit. Armenia developed in response a quite complex deterrent system that increasingly looked vulnerable to serial escalations. And so we had a situation essentially of serial deterrence, where a deterrent worked against a large all-out war, but not against periodic escalations along the line of contact. So since 2014, we've seen a cycle of such escalations, and this has basically also reflected the obsolescence of the ceasefire monitoring infrastructure fielded by the OSCE. That dates from the mid-1990s, a completely different era. It has consisted of just 6 people and hasn't been fit for purpose for at least a decade. So what we've seen then is a general climate of insecurity, dramatically narrowing the space for talks over the last 6 years. After the April 2016 4-day war, Armenia and Azerbaijan agreed to a number of measures to strengthen the ceasefire and move to substantive talks, but none of these measures were implemented. In April 2018, Armenia witnessed a bloodless velvet revolution bringing Nikol Pashinyan, an opposition activist, to power. And there were expectations in Azerbaijan that this augured a reset in the peace process. Much of these expectations were based on an analysis that Armenia had been under the control of a Karabakh clan, reflecting the fact that Presidents Kocharian and Sargsyan were natives of Karabakh. And the expectation was perhaps that Pashinyan, not being a native of Karabakh, would be more amenable to compromise. There were some initial positive steps. In Dushanbe in September 2018, Pashinyan and President Ilham Aliyev agreed to reinstate a hotline across the line of contact and cooperate on humanitarian issues. And last year was actually the quietest year on record in terms of ceasefire violations and casualties. There was this now notorious announcement that the foreign ministers had agreed on the necessity of preparing their populations for peace in January. But while there was a lull on the military situation, in terms of the public and online space, there was absolutely no let up. And preparing populations for peace, eventually, this was left as an empty rhetorical slogan that actually ended up discrediting the very idea of peace building. Another, I think, crucial midterm driver is the exit from unipolarity, the shifts from a US-led unipolar world based on liberal democracy to a multipolar world order contested by regional powers, often fielding more authoritarian norms of conflict management. And this is highly relevant in terms of the Karabakh conflict's very specific and peculiar position at the meeting point of these different geopolitical and normative realms. We've seen a regional context defined by multiplying theaters of conflict, where Russia and Turkey have been engaged in Syria and Libya, that have seen high risk, high reward interventions in support of embattled factions in civil wars. And some of the logic of these interventions has been that assertiveness on the battlefield is seen as the pathway to a place at the table. Now, in terms of short-term triggers, political relations soured in mid-2019 after an ill-advised speech by Nikol Pashinyan evoking the unity of Armenia and Karabakh in Stepanakert, and a number of other developments, the green light given to a third road crossing the occupied territories between Kapan and Hadrut, the inauguration of the de facto leader of Nagorno Karabakh in Shusha, which is a crucial symbolic site for Azerbaijanis, and then announcements suggesting that Shusha might become the territory's political capital had quite inflammatory effects on the Azerbaijani side. These tensions surfaced in a significant escalation in July of this year in the area of the international border, killing 17, mostly Azerbaijanis. And this saw unprecedented public protest in Azerbaijan in support of military action against Armenia. Following that July escalation, there was a new intensity of contacts between officials of the two ministries of defense in Turkey and Azerbaijan. There were pledges of Turkish support and open threats to Armenia. And finally, the timing from the pandemic to protests in Belarus to the US elections, September 2020 was a global conjuncture defined by the distraction of major powers, above all the United States, and the ability of global powers to set aside their differences on other issues and cooperate on this conflict has always been central to its containment. So perhaps this moment of distraction was seen as an opportune time for a military operation. So I'll hand over to Tom now, who will discuss the humanitarian consequences and international responses.
Thank you very much, Laurence, and thank you also to Anoush and Ipek for the invitation. Yes, this is a very tragic conflict. If you consider that the previous conflict lasted for more or less 3 years in the 1990s, and the death toll was around 20,000 over those 3 years. Obviously, there was mass displacement. We're seeing a huge humanitarian catastrophe in the space of 4 weeks already in this conflict. In terms of casualties, President Putin said the other day, he's obviously not the most reliable source, but he obviously has his own sources. He said that the casualty figures were already approaching 5,000. We know that the Armenian side is releasing its military casualty figures. They're now standing at around 900. We have, and these are mostly young men aged around 19 or 20, soldiers who were actually born, and this is a very kind of tragic fact on either side, born since the ceasefire. So this the second Karabakh war is actually people are dying who weren't even alive when the first one was being fought. There are many civilian casualties on both sides. The Karabakh Armenian city of Stepanakert has been under sustained bombardment, as have various Karabakhi towns and villages, some of which are now virtually empty. And there have been also Armenian missile strikes on a series of Azerbaijani cities near the line of contact, particularly Azerbaijan's second city of Ganja, where one attack alone killed 14 people, including a whole family. Today there were more reports of an attack on the town of Barda. So dozens of civilians, again, hard to put an exact number on it, but possibly around 100 on both sides have been killed. The Azerbaijani side has not released its military casualty figures, although people are sharing them on various things like the Telegram channel. So I can't really, I haven't looked into this at all, but there are frequent reports that the Azerbaijani military casualties as the attacking force have actually been even greater than the Armenian ones, even though Azerbaijan has obviously been having greater military success. So just to put that in context, this is already approaching for example, on the Armenian side, already approaching something like 2/3 of the per capita death toll of the United States in the Vietnam War as a whole, for just in 1 month for Armenia, and obviously slightly less for Azerbaijan, which has a bigger population, but still a very catastrophic figures. There's also been displacement. Nagorno Karabakh itself had a population of somewhere between 120, 140,000. It's a bit difficult to say. Reports that maybe 2/3 of the population has already displaced to Armenia, particularly to Goris, across the Lachin corridor, and also to Yerevan. We should also mention at this point that, of course, there's a global pandemic going on, and that one can see pictures of, as it were, bunkers in Stepanakert where people are sheltering from bombs and also wearing masks. But clearly, this has been a disastrous for the pandemic, and both countries are now seeing big spikes. And Armenia was already per capita one of the worst countries in Europe for COVID-19, and is obviously going to suffer increasingly from that. Azerbaijan a bit behind, but also very alarming figures. And I think it's also worth highlighting the human rights aspect of this conflict, where some of the reports are rather sketchy, but there are 2 very credible reports of atrocities by the Azerbaijani side in and around the small town, large village of Hadrut, which is an Armenian town in the south of Karabakh, where one video which was posted, which has been pretty much verified by Bellingcat and by the BBC, showing the execution of 2 Armenian prisoners of war in cold blood, and also a report of 5 elderly and I think disabled people in Hadrut who were caught by the Azerbaijani advance and were killed. So I think the human rights aspect of this is especially worrying, just when we consider that though the ceasefire was signed, there was never a rhetoric ceasefire in this conflict, and there's been 30 years of vicious, dehumanizing rhetoric from both sides. Probably stronger on the Azerbaijani side, simply because it was the losing side in the conflict. The Armenians could afford to, as it were, because having won a military victory, could afford to have a slightly less harsh rhetoric, but not much better on the Armenian side. But certainly a whole generation has grown up on both sides, believing that the other really is dehumanized, are savage. Azerbaijani schools, school children are shown pictures of the dead bodies in the Khojaly massacre of February 1992 and are told that this is what Armenians have done to your compatriots. So this is the mindset of people who are fighting in this war. There are also reports of many dead bodies out there which have not been recovered because these humanitarian ceasefires have not worked. So that's a very bleak situation. Let me just move on then to the international response, or possibly I should say lack of international response. Laurence has already mentioned that this comes at a particularly bad international moment for the world to focus on a conflict like this. The US distracted by the election. The US had already, apart from one brief effort by John Bolton in 2018, has largely disengaged from this conflict, despite its co-chair responsibilities under the Trump administration. The European countries still taking an interest, but rather less so. The OSCE, which is the organization, as Laurence mentioned, on which there were great hopes that it would become a robust international European security organization, is in crisis, very much shackled by problems between Russia and the West, and also the veto power of its small members, including Armenia and Azerbaijan, which leaves Russia as and I think both Laurence and I have written about this. I think both of us have, over the years, pushed back against the idea that Russia was pulling the strings on this conflict, which was a common trope to kind of read across Russia's rather more interventionist approach to other post-Soviet conflicts and believe that Russia was pulling the strings, that Russia was manipulating and every move in this conflict. I think both of us have written Russia was act. Laurence was interested in conflict, military equilibrium, which it helped to assist by supplying weapons to both sides, and also geopolitical equilibrium, that this was in Russia's interests. But that Russia really had no proper response once Azerbaijan, with the help of Turkey, challenged that equilibrium on September the 27th. Russia really has military treaty obligations to Armenia, but those only apply to the territory of the Republic of Armenia. They do not apply to Karabakh being outside Armenia. And Russia has basically sat and watched as the Armenian positions have slowly collapsed and has not intervened. Probably, for its own purposes, that's actually quite prudent strategy. It would be a very dangerous escalation if it did. But obviously this sends messages to the Armenians and to the Azerbaijanis that basically Russia actually does not have its much bite to go with its bark on this conflict. Russia certainly does not want a war with Azerbaijan, which would be destabilizing on many other fronts. So the result has been, possibly to Azerbaijan's own surprise, there was speculation at the beginning that they would take maybe 2 of the occupied regions, call a halt, and call for new negotiations with a strengthened position. That has not happened. Instead, the Azerbaijani military has advanced both in the north, but particularly in the south of Karabakh, and is now moving really quite close to the Lachin corridor, which connects Karabakh and Armenia. And were Azerbaijani forces to take the Lachin corridor, Karabakh would basically be encircled, and we'd be under a huge Azerbaijani siege. So this is the situation. And there have been 3 ceasefires called, one by each co-chair country, as Laurence has mentioned. Each one has failed almost instantly. it's, we do not have absolute proof, but the Armenians are basically desperate for this to stop. There's no logical reason why the Armenians would want to break a ceasefire. It's Azerbaijan who has the public support, the military momentum in this conflict. So it's logical to assume, and there is evidence to confirm this, that Azerbaijan is the one who has basically ignored those ceasefires in order to keep up the military momentum that it feels in its favor. And in so doing, it has really sent a challenge to the co-chair countries, France, the US, and Russia. I would draw your attention to a speech President Aliyev made yesterday, in which he spent a lot of time denigrating the Armenians, giving some rather bogus history lessons about how there were no Armenians in Karabakh before the 19th century, very urging on his compatriots, but also failing conspicuously to mention the fact that his foreign minister had just been in Washington, had met with Pompeo, that President Trump had pledged to end the conflict. There was absolutely no mention in the speech of this American ceasefire or American peace initiative. This seemed almost a rather deliberate slight to the United States to kind of put the United States in its place. So there's a kind of attempt here, I think, by Azerbaijan for a whole new kind of international configuration. Another thing, in another diplomatic theatre, there was an attempt to pass a new UN Security Council resolution by France and Russia. It gets a little arcane, but basically France and Russia did not want to refer to the UN resolutions of the 1990s on the basis that these were from the previous war and are no longer relevant. Azerbaijan did want to have reference to those UN resolutions, and with the support of various non-aligned states in the UN Security Council, that idea of a new resolution by France and Russia was blocked. So there's the UN track has also, as it were, faltered and petered out. So this is basically the diplomatic and international context we're seeing, in which Azerbaijan basically feels momentum behind it, and is more likely to be slowed by the terrain, by the weather, by some Armenian resistance, which we haven't yet seen than by any diplomatic initiative. Let me hand back to Laurence.
Thanks, Tom. So we thought we'd sort of finish up with looking at the potential dynamics of development, different scenarios as to where this could go. And very broadly speaking, I mean, one could frame this in terms of three potential dynamics. The first is the military dynamic, events on the battlefield determining the political outcomes and essentially driving them. And I think we're still in that scenario at present. The second scenario could be a regionalization of this conflict management process, squeezing out Euro-Atlantic actors and creating a kind of Russian-Turkish tandem. And then the third scenario would be a revival in multilateral diplomacy. And I'll go into a few more considerations on the first two, and then Tom will finish up by looking at the third option. So in terms of the military dynamics, as Tom alluded to, we've seen a dramatically different Azerbaijani performance on the battlefield compared to April 2016. In that 4-day war, between 800 and 2,000 square hectares were retaken by the Azerbaijani military, whereas what we've seen now is a dramatic kind of breakthrough almost as far along the Azerbaijani-Iranian border, almost as far as the border with Armenia. These are the lower lying areas. They were captured in 1993 without much of a fight by local Armenian forces at that time. So this is actually the first time that these territories have been intensively fought over. There is some debate as to whether the Armenian retreat is simply a result of being overwhelmed and pushed back, or whether there was an element of tactical retreat from indefensible areas. One, of course, doesn't exclude the other. Azerbaijani forces have also recaptured a pocket of territory in the northeast, including the village of Talish, which also swapped hands in April 2016. It's not completely clear, sitting here in London, as to whether Azerbaijani control over Madagis has been consolidated or not in that northeast sector. So there seems to be agreement that the principal battlefield dynamic is taking the form of a contest between Azerbaijani aerial attrition and Armenian terrestrial control. State-of-the-art Turkish and Israeli drones have had a game-changing effect compared to previous encounters. They have exposed outdated Armenian air defense and exposed land forces with very considerable losses. So in terms of why this improved Azerbaijani military performance, I mean, Azerbaijan has been preparing, has been investing considerably in its defense sector, but it seems that many of the weapons that we're seeing deployed were present in April 2016, not all of them, but many of them. And so this element of lent Turkish capability really does seem to be crucial. That includes intelligence and targeting support that was perhaps visible, for instance, today in the attack on and the targeting of the de facto Nagorno Karabakh Minister of Defense, Jalal Harutyunyan. New drone tech in the form of these Bayraktar TB2 drones and allegedly their operators. These drones have been in Azerbaijani possession only for a very short time, and so it makes it plausible that they are being operated by Turkish operators. There's the alleged use of air power F-16s that have been photographed at Ganja and then Gabala. And then, as already noted, the presence of foreign fighters from Syria. Denials that this is the case need to be weighed up against an increasingly substantial body of evidence, photographic, video, interview materials, and the research of authoritative experts on the foreign fighter phenomenon that indicate that this is indeed the case. And perhaps their role is to absorb politically costly casualties in the frontline fighting. So in terms of paths of development in the military dynamic, one would be an outright Azerbaijani military victory. As Tom noted, the Lachin corridor is currently seemingly within reach. That would result in an encirclement and a siege dynamic, as Tom mentioned. And there is perhaps a sense in which there is a race against time. Winter is coming, that could slow down the fighting. And this could mean that we might see surging tactics in the days and weeks to come to take the Lachin corridor as a decisive strategic change. The other pathway, however, could be a kind of a military stalemate and a much more protracted attritional, asymmetric conflict with Armenian defenses within highland territories on terrain that is more suitable for defensive action and basically taking the dynamic down into a much more protracted and complicated dynamic. So those are the two potential pathways that we see in terms of the military dynamic. In terms of regionalization, we've discussed the roles of Russia and Turkey, and I would recall the analysis of Russian scholar Maxim Suchkov, who's analyzed Turkey's goals in this conflict as essentially making a bid for a new deal with Russia, converting this conflict into one along a spectrum where Russia and Turkey are sometimes operating as rivals, sometimes as partners. They share, of course, a desire for structural and strategic autonomy from Euro-Atlantic actors, and in that sense are perhaps not completely at odds with one another. And so there's a sense of geopolitical entrepreneurship driving this potential new deal. And what we're seeing is the spreading and rippling outwards of developments in the South Caucasus. For example, in the Russian airstrike yesterday on a militia base in Syria, killing 78 people belonging to the Faylaq al-Sham faction, from which fighters were allegedly being prepared to deploy to Azerbaijan. So we're seeing the kind of the interconnectedness of these different regional theaters and this regionalization dynamic. So Tom has highlighted the constraints on Russian options in this context. I would agree that Moscow has cultivated a strategic ambiguity over recent decades in this conflict, and this has, I think, obscured the fragility of Russia's position in the face of the current Turkish Azerbaijani campaign and its fundamental dilemma. If it acts decisively to support Armenia, it risks losing Azerbaijan and ending up with a sphere of influence in the South Caucasus that's restricted to Armenia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. But if it doesn't act, it sees itself basically being made irrelevant as a security actor in what is supposedly its near abroad. So some kind of a deal or trade-off with Turkey would be one route out of that dilemma. But it brings a sense in which, although this has not been to date a proxy conflict, there would be a new proxy dynamic coming into it. But this carries a number of significant risks. Unlike embattled factions in civil wars in Libya and Syria, Armenia and Azerbaijan are independent states. They are sovereign states. Their leaderships have mandates to rule, and they have their populations behind them, and they may be less amenable, less vulnerable to external control and leverage than factions in Middle Eastern and North African civil wars. And another huge risk here, I think, is of a very top-down kind of a geopolitical conflict management approach that would have very little interest and capacity to address local concerns, the real drivers, the local drivers of this conflict, and to mediate those issues. So I think Tom has highlighted this in a number of presentations. We're actually sort of 100 years on from the last time that Russia and Turkey faced off in the South Caucasus, and that ended in a new status quo that didn't really take into consideration either Armenian or Azerbaijani aspirations. So there's a risk of history repeating itself, perhaps. So with that, I'll hand back to Tom, and he'll finish with a few thoughts on the possibility for a revival in multilateral diplomacy.
Thanks, Laurence. I'll be quite short, partly because I've got nothing much positive to say, I regret, but also because I'm conscious of the time and we do want to get a discussion in. Yes, I think us kind of neutral observers, the outcome we would most like to see would be a revival of multilateral diplomacy, probably through the OSCE format, maybe a wider OSCE involvement, which we saw in the 90s with not just the 3 co-chair countries, and a more people and rights-based approach to the conflict, a more inclusive approach to the conflict, which included people like the Karabakh Armenians, the Karabakh Azerbaijanis, IDPs, a great engagement with society. This is things that we've advocated for many years, but let's be clear, in the current context, this has become much, much more difficult. There's a very toxic information war going on. The democratic deficit, which has been at the heart of this conflict since 1921, is even greater. And besides, there's also has to be a hard security aspect to resolving this conflict, because if there is to be a resolution, it would need some kind of international peacekeeping operation, and that also looks much more difficult now that we've got this resumption of fighting. It isn't impossible, but it would need, I think, a very concerted effort by European powers backed by the United States, certainly, and certainly this administration, I don't think is capable of it. Possibly the next administration would be. So it's a big ask, and I think it's very much dependent also on. It's still possible, I think, if the fighting was to kind of halt at this stage, but if we were to see what I think is the really bad scenario, which is possibly just a few days away, which is an Azerbaijani assault on Karabakh itself, then I'm afraid I don't think we've got any peace process left at all, to be honest. So on that rather gloomy note, I'll hand back to Anoush.
Thank you both so much, Laurence and Tom, for sharing these important perspectives and giving us such a rich context to understand what's going on today and give us an idea of what might come. We already have a number of questions coming in, but I wanted to remind our audience that we'll take the questions through the Zoom chat. You can send the questions directly to me through the private chat, or if you send it to the whole group, I'll also collect them there. I'll collate them. And we have some questions that have a similar vein, so I will perhaps paraphrase them and direct them to our speakers. To start off, though, I would like to ask a question while I give the audience a chance to type up their questions. As we mentioned, Ipek and I in the beginning, and also both of you, Tom and Laurence, mentioned in your presentations, for the past quarter century, this simmering conflict has stayed more or less a local issue, or at least an issue of the post-Soviet region. But now with the entry of Turkey into the war on the side of Azerbaijan, it threatens to upset the long-standing balance of power in the South Caucasus, which has been Russia's sphere of influence since the fall of the USSR. So my question is specifically about Turkey. What does Turkey stand to gain by participating in this conflict, and how might this benefit Erdogan's increasingly authoritarian government? And how does this figure into the broader constellation of powers between Russia, Turkey, Iran, Syria, France, Europe, and the US? So this is a question to both of you. I'd love to hear from both of you on that.
Shall I start? Well, I mean, I've spoken to a number of people in Turkey. I don't know if Ipek, you want to weigh in as well, but there are different views which may not be mutually exclusive. One is that this, because Azerbaijan and Turkey are so close, that this is very much Erdogan's sees this very much through a domestic lens. Don't forget that his coalition party is the nationalist MHP, so he's playing to a nationalist constituency. But also the CHP, the main opposition party, has also backed Azerbaijan quite unequivocally, which leads basically the Kurdish parties being the only ones who are more equivocal. So it plays well with the Turkish public. That would be a foreign policy success if our Turkic brothers achieve this victory. That seems to be part of it. Equally, perhaps the other thing is a bargaining with Russia, that there are three theatres, as Laurence has mentioned, where Russia and Turkey are on opposite sides. There's this one, but there's also Libya and Syria. We know that the Presidents Putin and Erdogan spoke by telephone on October the 14th. This was kind of widely viewed as the Sultan and the Tsar chatting on the phone. Nothing has changed, unfortunately, in more than a century. And there was a lot of speculation that are they bargaining, with chess pieces over these three theatres. But I guess there was a point when it looked as though Turkey might be a restraining influence, calling on Azerbaijan to de-escalate this conflict, but we haven't seen that. And on the contrary, if anything, we've seen an escalation in Azerbaijani ambitions, which suggests that Turkey is really quite serious in trying to see a kind of an Azerbaijani victory here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add. I'm not a Turkey expert myself, but it seems to me that Turkey's kind of power play in the South Caucasus is consistent with a wider set of much more assertive foreign policy moves, which is described as neo-Ottomanism in the policy literature, a massive transition from the zero problems with neighbors approach. One can only wonder what Turkey's role might be now if the protocols process, football diplomacy and normalization had proceeded. So I think I agree with the broader sense in which this is playing well for a domestic base in Turkey in the light of quite serious economic conditions and decline in Turkey, which is only going to get worse, I think, with the post-COVID context. This is another theater of conflict where Turkish military tech is on show and has been shown to be effective, and developing the domestic arms industry is something close, I think, to Erdogan's heart and also to his family. So yeah, in that sense, a convergence of different factors, but Turkey wants to be a global power, and inserting itself into conflicts is seen as the way to do that.
Thank you both so much. So there's a number of questions coming in. I'm going to share one from a participant, Tamar. It's a question to both participants. Tamar writes, there have been claims by Armenians as well as other reporters that there is ethnic cleansing and genocide taking place on Armenians, and that this war is the context through which Azerbaijan and Turkey are aiming to get rid of the Armenian population of the region entirely. Could you comment on this question of genocide, and is this framework of genocide helpful or strategic in thinking about what's happening in the region? This is, again, a question for both of you, so whoever would like to begin.
Okay. I mean, I can kick off. Well, well, the entry of Turkey obviously has reinvigorated and lent itself to a reading of events through that framework. I mean, I think ethnic cleansing is something that is very much part of the legacy of the conflict between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in the 1990s. There was always a practice of clearing, of cleansing captured territories during that conflict. When we think of the Azerbaijani advance in summer 1992, or the Armenian advance in a year later, in 1993, there was ethnic cleansing of both nationalities. And now it is the Azerbaijani army that is advancing. And there have been a number of signals from the renaming of settlements that have been captured within the former Nagorno Karabakh autonomous oblast, so renamed from Armenian to Azerbaijani names, which puts in doubt the idea that there would be a meaningful cultural autonomy and space for the preservation of an Armenian identity in Nagorno Karabakh. Tom mentioned atrocities where residual civilian populations have not been evacuated, they have been killed. That's been true this year. It was also true in April, on the 3rd of April, 2016, when 3 elderly Armenians were killed in the village of Talish. And so, one has to weigh up this evidence, these facts, against the pledges of the highest level of autonomy and so on. This is a discussion that both Tom and I have had many times in Azerbaijan. There has never been a document setting out Azerbaijan's offer in terms of what that autonomy means, what kinds of rights and guarantees the Azerbaijani state is willing to guarantee for an Armenian population. There is also active disinformation about 30,000 Armenians allegedly living in Azerbaijan outside of Nagorno Karabakh. That is simply not true. So I think in that sense, this is not a time to underestimate Armenian fears. of renewed ethnic cleansing as something that has happened repeatedly in the past, has never been addressed, and does not appear to be contradicted by these events accompanying the Azerbaijani advance.
I'd agree with all of that. Let me just add one thing, though, which is that I think I've already mentioned Russia's treaty obligations to Armenia. I think the likelihood that there will be any Azerbaijani or Turkish troops on the territory of Armenia is extremely small, because that would immediately trigger a Russian defense of Armenia. So I think the genocide narrative, I think, when applied to Armenia, is not credible, simply for that reason, that Armenia is a sovereign state. Now, clearly, and again, I think there is indeed a real fear of atrocities, of ethnic cleansing. However, I think, hopefully, I don't think Azerbaijan is interested as a state in the destruction of Armenians. I think what we're more seeing is ferocious fighting and soldiers who would commit atrocities, not that it would be a state-sanctioned mass killing of Armenians. These sound like rather fine distinctions, but I think that they're important ones to make. I don't want to underestimate the gravity of the situation, and also I do think that we do need to, for a moment, just pause and recall the enormous humanitarian catastrophe that Azerbaijan suffered in the 1990s. More than 500,000 people displaced from their homes, which, in what can only be called ethnic cleansing, dozens of towns and villages completely emptied and then destroyed, and the people expelled. And that is obviously the ground on which Azerbaijani frustration and this war is based. So, although we can certainly lay the blame for Azerbaijan starting the war on September the 27th, there's also a very strong case that Armenia is the co-sponsor of this conflict by not addressing that very, very serious issue of the occupation of Armenian lands in the 1990s.
And just to finish on that, I mean, I think everything that we're talking about underscores the need for a proper investigation and kind of a reckoning with these very grave human rights violations on both sides. There is seemingly an embedded culture of impunity for such violations. And I think that stems from the 1990s. There never was a process like the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. Many of the events of recent days and weeks, from what I've been talking about in terms of civilians being killed in Hadrut, but also the missile strikes on Ganja, that needs investigation. Looks very much like a war crime. So really need to kind of break the cycle of impunity for these kinds of violations.
Thank you both for responding to that question. We have a few questions about the role of Iran from Laura Cholakian, Emra Yildiz, again to both panelists. They write both separately. There was a mention of the regional paradigm between Russia and Turkey. Can you please elaborate on the role of Iran in this conflict, especially given that the Deputy Foreign Minister of Affairs of Iran will be visiting Baku, Moscow, and Yerevan soon? And also, can you speak to generally the place of Iran in the Caucasus, and particularly between Armenia and Azerbaijan? So again, to both of you.
Well, I don't think either of us thinks of themselves as an Iran expert. So, I mean, I tend to see Iran as a kind of an ambivalent bystander to this conflict. Perhaps unlike the other regional powers, it doesn't really have an ideological framework for approaching the South Caucasus, even though obviously very large parts of the Caucasus used to be part of Iran. It tends to be a bit more pragmatic. in terms of Iran's responses, it has an unsuccessful history of mediation, having tried to mediate in May 1992. It'll be interesting to see whether Iran has any traction now in its efforts. But I think, yeah, there is a whole new context now that Iran is facing along its northern border. I don't think there is any reason to believe that the restored Azerbaijani control over that border is going to change. And so, you know, Iran has to adapt to that. I recall a statement from a couple of days ago in which a senior Iranian official was talking about the impossibility of geopolitical changes to borders, which I kind of read as a warning shot in case any encroachments on Armenia's actual borders was being envisaged. But I think the other key issue is Iranian Azerbaijan. There have been mass protests, vocal criticism in Iranian Azerbaijan, in Tabriz and other cities, criticizing Rouhani's kind of, you know, more neutral stance as such. So I think, you know, a mix of different factors, but a lack of any real influence to change events, to drive events.
Let me just add a couple of sentences to that. I think one could put Georgia in a way in the same bracket as Iran, as being a neighbor, which is basically in a lose-lose situation in this conflict, that they want to have good relations with both countries for various reasons. Both of them have Armenian and Azeri minority populations in their country. They would benefit from peaceful relations between these countries, and both of them look on with horror at conflict, but also have little traction as mediators. Both of them are vetoed, Iran by the United States and Georgia by Russia. So both of them are really a bit helpless looking on and can do things a bit in the margins and behind the scenes, but unfortunately have little traction.
Thank you so much. We have more questions on the list, but I want to take this opportunity as moderator to ask another of my own questions, if you don't mind. So I know that both of you are in London and not here in the midst of this U.S. presidential election that we are all sort of mired in, and you know it's coming up in a week. So seeing that you both are located in our neighboring country across the pond and maybe have a degree of objective distance, I want to ask about how U.S. domestic politics might play into this conflict and how it's become, just in the last couple of days, a talking point in the U.S. presidential election. And from my own just sort of watching what's going on social media, I've been noticing and fascinated by how in the last few days, Armenian Americans have been showing up at Trump rallies in order to raise awareness and garner support from the Trump administration for ending the conflict. And just, I think it was on Sunday, Trump said, look at Armenia, they're incredible people, they're fighting like hell. And he was, you know, shouting out to Armenians who had come to an Ohio rally with flags and spirit. And he said something like, the problems they have, the deaths, the fighting and everything else, we'll get that straightened out. I call that an easy one. So, and then meanwhile, Biden was criticizing the Trump administration for coddling the Turkish president, Erdogan, who is supporting the Azerbaijan. So my question again for both of you is, how might this US domestic politics and the election play into the possibility of some kind of US involvement in trying to create a lasting peace, if at all?
Well, certainly I think the diaspora factor, I think, is going to become important in the US, and although in France, possibly in Russia, although we see that a bit less, that if the situation worsens and Karabakh is encircled, then I'm sure we're going to see this is going to become a massive cause for the Armenian diaspora. It's going to displace genocide recognition, which obviously has slipped a bit down the agenda. As you know, we're seeing the Recognize Artsakh movement, which I think may gain a little traction in some US states, but it would, I think, as soon as you recognize Artsakh as independent, you're basically killing off the current any hope of negotiations really between Baku and Yerevan. You're treating this as a pure Stepanakert, Baku conflict, and which I think therefore could have rather unfortunate results for those who advocated. So I think, sure, I think this will be something playing in, but it's obviously something that US politicians have to be careful with, because they want to be seen as an honest broker. And the Biden statement, I think, the Biden statement on this conflict, I think, was recognized the realities and talked about occupied territories of Azerbaijan. So I think a Biden administration would be more professional on this issue, I think would reactivate, hopefully, the US co-chairmanship. But obviously, as you know, if that does happen, that won't be until early next year. You know, I think an awful lot, unfortunately, can happen on the ground before the US reasserts itself.
No, I don't really have anything to add to that, except that I think perhaps Trump's presidency has been seen as a time for, you know, kind of unilateral norm challenging. A Biden presidency, I think, would see an attempt to revive some of the core values of American multilateralism, but American exit from hegemony, to cite the title of a book written by Alex Cooley and his co-author, I think is a longer term process. So yeah, I would hope to see, as Tom says, a reactivation of US attention, but in terms of leverage and events happening on the ground, I think that's harder to see.
Thank you so much, both of you. So we have a question from Ronald Suni for Laurence Brewers. He writes, could you please explain what you mean by authoritarian forms of negotiations and solutions replacing earlier OSCE liberal forms? This was a question that was sent during your presentation, so it's, you know, from earlier on in the presentation. So that one's for Laurence.
Yeah, in my book, Armenia and Azerbaijan, Anatomy of a Rivalry, I talk about what I call authoritarian conflict strategies, which are basically illiberal strategies that are undermining the basis and the political terrain for the implementation of the basic principles, which are founded in the concept of the liberal peace. So, you know, liberal ideas around representation, voting mechanisms, referendums, return of displaced people, inclusiveness, and so on. So I break these authoritarian conflict strategies down into three. One of them is control, basically exercising a monopoly on the negotiations process. We've seen that, you know, in terms of meaningful negotiations, there have been 5 or 6 people that have been around the table over the last decade. Significant constituencies who used to participate in the process in the late 1990s, such as the de facto authorities, the elected and other representatives as the indirect parties to the Minsk process, have been excluded. The second authoritarian conflict strategy is what I call communalization, which is, you know, an absolutely ahistorical communal form of narrative identity, basically excluding and narrowing identities down to absolutely kind of primordially conceived and incompatible national identities. And then the third authoritarian conflict strategy is coercion, and perhaps we're seeing, you know, a very vivid use of that strategy over the last month. So these conflict strategies can be contrasted with peace strategies. That's something that we haven't seen for a very long time in this conflict. Yeah, I guess the triumph of authoritarian conflict strategies is what has brought us to where we are today.
Thank you so much. So we have 2 questions that are about sources from Gonja Sonmez and Ulvi Ismail. Gonja writes, what are some of the sources you find objective and reliable when you're trying to get on the ground information from either side in the war? And Ulvi Ismail asks about the the drone and F-16s, that some, one side says that there are drones being used in F-16s and the other side denies these. So, both of you are investigative journalists, and this is a question about, sources and how, when one side is saying something totally different, how do you manage to sift through these contradictory information?
Right. Thanks, Anoush. Well, I think both of us had the misfortune to be spending a lot of time on social media, which is 9 parts, lead to 1 part gold. But there is some good material out there. People who are doing mapping of the conflict zone. There are some brave journalists out there, and there are some good local sources. I think Artak Beglarian, who is the ombudsman in Nagorno Karabakh, releases information with videos, and obviously there's a ideological message there, but I have no reason to doubt the information that he's providing from the conflict scene. And we've also seen Human Rights Watch, ICRC on the scene. So it's actually in the 1990s, it was almost impossible to get a good picture of what was going on in this conflict. And I think there's obviously, as with almost any other major event in the world, there's too much information rather than too little. But I think it is possible, if one is dogged, to build up a picture. Also, President Aliyev's speeches, he's giving a lot of information, and then he talks about captured settlements, and then one can check later to see whether that's the case. On drones, again, there are people who are recording that. F-16s, President Aliyev yesterday, he confirmed in his speech, he said, we've got F-16s on our territory and we're keeping them. I can't remember exactly what the phrase was, but some phrase like, if we need to have an appropriate response to international interference. So this was also in the same speech in which he was deliberately ignoring Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Trump. He was also proudly saying we do have F-16s on our territory.
I don't really have anything to add to that.
Excellent. Yeah, very interesting. So Kanar Hudoyan asks, writes, some anti-Nikol Pashinyan parties in Armenia are demanding his resignation. And this may further fuel the assumption that this war is not necessarily for Karabakh, but for what she writes, the revolution. So what is your take on the risk of counter-revolution and a coup d'etat, I guess, against Pashinyan? And does this make it impossible for Armenia to make concessions? So basically the role of Pashinyan and whether he, what his maneuverability is. This is a question for both. So Tom, if you'd like to begin.
I was going to defer to Laurence as the author of the book on the Velvet Revolution. I'll just have a couple of words. I saw this statement from Vazgen Manoukian today, who obviously used to be somebody in Armenia, but is not particularly, I think, an authoritative figure. My guess, and it's very much a guess, is that I think, to be honest, Nikol Pashinyan has handled this conflict extremely badly. I think he was very unwise to challenge the basic principle man, and that left him very vulnerable. And Azerbaijan, I think he's handled it very badly. And I find his President Aliyev has a very clear PR message. You can see who he's talking to. A lot of it, I'm sure, is false. But Mr. Pashinyan, I find his messages quite incoherent, to be honest. Having said that, I think there's an Armenian solidarity principle. I don't think the Armenians want to be seen to be ditching their leader in the midst of a war, particularly when his son and now his wife, indeed, have volunteered to join the armed forces. So I'm sure there will be a reckoning with Mr. Pashinyan, but I don't think that's going to be for today.
Yes, I think I agree with that. I think there have been a number of very ill-advised steps and speeches and symbolic moves, which I alluded to in my presentation. But Nikol Pashinyan has a democratic mandate. And there are a lot of people in Armenia who are very concerned about the trajectory of the Velvet Revolution, and that the gains that were made following April-May 2018 will be lost as a result of this conflict. So I think there will be a reckoning, and I think that reckoning will surely acknowledge that it's not just about some perhaps unwise rhetoric and moves in the last couple of years, but the much broader strategy of holding on to territories and mortgaging security, relying on Russia, that was enacted by the previous two presidents in different ways. So yes, I think there will be a reckoning, but it won't happen, I think, until there is a more definitive outcome on the battlefield.
Can I just mention something else as we're on this subject? I also think we need to pay quite a lot of attention to Azerbaijan New Politics. Obviously, Ilham Aliyev is riding high. He's obviously doing extremely well. He's got the whole nation behind him. There's this enormous euphoria in Azerbaijan. But he's also mobilized the public from below. And we know that from any of us who were watching Azerbaijan in the early 90s, that Azerbaijan does have this capacity for political mobilization from below, which was very destabilizing in the 1990s. So he's now empowered the military, who had been decapitated by his father after the defeat in the mid-90s. There are many opposition figures who are now firmly behind the war, who are also, we know, strong critics of the president. So they're using this support of the war to be out there in public and boost their own legitimacy with the public. So I'm sure whatever happens, even if it stops now, Ilham Aliyev will be riding high, but he's also riding a tiger. And I think that tiger of public mobilization could and will almost certainly enter domestic politics in Azerbaijan and could start, targeting issues like corruption and handling of the economy as well. So I don't think it's actually necessarily good news for Mr. Aliyev as well, this war, paradoxically, either.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you both so much. So another question from William Hollister, writing from Yerevan. He writes, today is the 21st anniversary of a terrorist attack in the Armenian parliament, which apparently stopped the Key West Agreement. And his question is, could Azerbaijan's offensive be an effort to implement the Key West Agreement's key elements?
Well, we don't have absolute clarity on what the Key West agreements or what the negotiations were about, but they were reportedly about an exchange of territories and corridor access. So my sense is that what we're seeing now, and certainly that's the way in which the Azerbaijani leadership is framing this, is a kind of a partial implementation of the basic principles, which foresee the return of, certainly in an earlier stage, 5 of the 7 occupied territories to Azerbaijani jurisdiction. So I think that might be more the framework rather than Key West as such. Tom, I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think Key West was 2001 and the shootings were in 1999. So I think we're making too many assumptions there to link the two. In fact, it was a very murky incident in the parliament. But to believe that it was linked to the peace process is to believe that somehow Vazgen Manukyan was about to swing behind a big peace initiative in Armenia, which
Vazgen Sargsyan.
Sorry, Vazgen Sargsyan. Sorry, wrong Vazgen. Thank you for the correction. Vazgen Sargsyan, which I don't actually believe it. This is more a fairly common trope I find amongst Azerbaijanis, but I don't believe it has many believers of that theory on the Armenian side.
Thanks for clearing that up. A question from Ian Kelly. Can you talk about resupply? will Russia and Turkey replenish the combatants with weapons and material? If so, how? So I guess this is a question of, if this becomes a war of attrition, how long can either side go? And are their backers really behind them? And that wasn't specifically to us, one or the other. So would either of you like to take a stab at that?
Well, I think that there have already been a lot of reports and speculation. There's a lot of material on Twitter about flights that are allegedly bringing replenishments to the Azerbaijani war effort. I have also seen similar reports concerning Russian flights. I think what I would highlight here is that which policy or which supply route is easier in a way. I think, you know, Turkey's ability to supply and replenish Azerbaijan is in many ways easier than Russia's ability to replenish and supply Armenian forces. That's partly because Russia doesn't have a kind of a clear political or legal logic for supporting forces in Nagorno Karabakh itself. It's quite overextended. So it has established a camp now near the village of Teh, which is just next to the Lachin corridor. You've got the base at Gyumri, but it's not that big. So, you know, the sense in which Russia can effectively resupply Armenia is quite complicated logistically, more complicated. I mean, I really see Russia as being kind of Janus-faced in this conflict. It has the option to act as a kind of a geopolitical patron supporting one of the parties, but it also has its multilateralist face. It prizes, to a degree, symbolic cooperation with France and the US on a secondary issue, resolving or mediating in this conflict. And the more that it would invest in an active policy of supporting one of the parties, the more that detracts from its role as an arbiter, transcending the conflict. So I think in that sense, there are both kind of practical and political obstacles to a clear Russian resupply route.
Yeah, excellent. One more question from Stephen Reed. He writes, I think Tom mentioned that perhaps as much as 1/2 or 2/3 of the Nagorno Karabakh population has fled to the Republic of Armenia over the past month, yet I'm seeing very little information about those refugees in the Armenian press and social media, which may suggest that many of them have arrived recently. This seems like a huge aspect of the unfolding humanitarian crisis, given especially Armenia's economic and pandemic-related problems. If the staggering number of refugees was confirmed, do you think that would elicit greater, more tangible international attention, if not intervention? So I think this is directed towards Tom, but you're both welcome to answer.
Certainly international attention, and I'm sure, you know, the EU, for example, is, when conversations I think both Laurence and I have had with the EU, because it doesn't have any formal part in the negotiations, the EU is I think trying to focus its attention on a humanitarian response, and I think this is something which has been mentioned in conversations with the EU. So I certainly, and the UK government as well, which I think is about. I don't think it's a secret. This week is about to announce a humanitarian response to this crisis. So I'm sure this is something that they will be addressing. There are actually reports on the Azerbaijani side that because of these repeated shelling of these frontline settlements, that there were actually IDPs from the 90s who were living in settlements near the front line who have been displaced for a second time by the fighting, hopefully temporarily, but have also been displaced.
Yeah, I mean, I think the latest data I saw claimed around 2,000 homes destroyed in some of these frontline cities. So I think there are also going to be displaced families on the Azerbaijani side.
Yes. So our last question is from Katie Pierce. I saved this one so it could open up a chance for both of you to offer any concluding comments. Katie asks or writes, let's imagine that things continue as they are and Azerbaijan continues to gain territory and Armenia doesn't have much to bargain with. What might things look like in 10 years in Nagorno Karabakh, Armenia and Azerbaijan? But I'll open that to both of you to offer your concluding thoughts in relation to that question or otherwise, and then we'll wrap up. Laurence, would you like to begin?
Sure. I mean, I've seen a lot of commentary that if Azerbaijan restores control over the whole of Nagorno Karabakh, that then the conflict is resolved. I would just highlight that a military victory, a very one-sided military victory in 1994 did not lead to a resolution of the conflict. I've seen a very interesting thread on Twitter that basically suggested that if there is a restoration of Azerbaijani control, that wouldn't mean the end of the conflict. There would be the risk then of a revanchism in Armenia. Armenia would prepare perhaps for another conflict. It would have presumably a quite radical new Karabakh Armenian diaspora community. And the potential for another conflict, a few decades into the future. So in that sense, I don't think that a military solution offers a resolution of the situation. It didn't before, and it won't again. So that's how I see that, and I fully support what Tom was saying. We saw in the 1990s the impact of veterans on domestic politics in Armenia. If the current dynamic continues to unfold, there will be an alternative power base, a new power base in Azerbaijan. Living with victory is often has unpredictable and not necessarily positive consequences.
Thanks. Yeah, can you hear me? My connection is not quite so good. Can you still hear me? Let me try and speak anyway, and hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, I would agree that there is an enforced peace is a bad peace. I've just published a piece in Foreign Affairs, which you can look up. Something about no compromise possible between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in which the failed quest for absolute security in this conflict. So I think, I think Laurence has made this point. There's no military victory in this conflict. So, let alone looking ahead 10 years, I think looking ahead 10 days is going to be absolutely crucial. I think we're reaching a very critical moment in this conflict, in which I think if it was to halt just about now, I think there would be a chance for some kind of negotiations. But I think if the Lachin corridor is taken and Karabakh is encircled, then I think Armenian side will resort to all sorts of desperate measures, and I think we're going to see a very much more dangerous and unpredictable conflict, unfortunately.
Thank you both so much for offering these concluding remarks. It was really an interesting roundtable with both of you. I'd like to, first of all, express my gratitude to both of our expert guests, Laurence Brewers and Tom Waal, for sharing their perspectives. And I'd also like to thank Professor İpek Yosmaoğlu, the director of the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies program here at the Buffett Institute at Northwestern University, for organizing this event, and to Gina Steck and Robert Trujillo for organizing all of the behind the scenes technical support. And finally, to our audience, we're happy to have had a good turnout for this important discussion. All of you for listening and for asking questions. It was really a pleasure to be able to be here all together, even though we were talking about a tragic unfolding of this conflict, and we'll hope to hear better news in the coming days. Thank you again, all of us, for joining us, and keep your eyes out for further programming from the Keyman Modern Turkish Studies program.
Thank you so much, Anoush and Ipek.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.